They said the church organ was broken, but when the pipe started bleeding during Sunday service and a body fell from inside, the entire congregation screamed. He was just the musician until they put the murder on him. But what he uncovered inside that sanctuary will shatter your faith in everything you thought was sacred. Watch the full story, because the silence was never holy. It was hiding a body. It happened during the third hymn. The choir had just raised their voices to the crescendo of "How Great Thou Art" when the organ released a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't a missed note or a stuck key. It was a low, guttural groan, metallic and wet, like something alive trying to breathe through brass. I felt the vibration beneath my fingers before the first scream pierced the sanctuary. A teenage girl from the front pew had turned around, mouth agape, pointing at the massive pipe just above the altar. From it, thick red streaks began to crawl downward, bleeding across the golden trim like veins bursting beneath porcelain skin. Gasps turned into chaos. People stumbled back, knocking over hymnals and wooden pews. Mothers covered their children's eyes. Some knelt to pray. But the music didn't stop. That unholy sound grew louder, darker, and then silence, complete and suffocating. Police were called before the final note of the choir faded. By the time I stood up from the organ bench, 2 officers had already made their way past the trembling ushers, through the sanctuary, and toward me. They didn't ask me anything. They just grabbed my arms, turned me around, and cuffed me in front of the still bleeding pipes. Behind them stood Reverend Simon Brooks, hands clasped before his chest, his white collar gleaming under the stained glass light. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stared at me like he knew this day would come. I wasn't allowed to speak. Not to the choir. Not to the press. Not even to the other musicians. As the congregation spilled out onto the sidewalk, I sat in the back of the police cruiser, watching the sanctuary doors close, locking behind them more than just faith. They locked in secrets, buried deep within brass and wood, now leaking their truth. At the station, they asked the same question over and over. Why were your fingerprints inside the central pipe? I didn't have an answer. I hadn't opened the central pipe in my life. I wasn't even allowed to tune it. Only the reverend and the facilities manager had keys to that chamber. But my prints were there. On the inner rim, on the side of the latch, on the tool used to remove the pipe's crown. Then they showed me the body. What was left of it? Bones wrapped in decayed choir robes. A femur snapped clean in half. Fabric still tangled in the curve of the rib cage. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't understand. I had played that organ every Sunday for 3 years. And all this time, she'd been inside it. I whispered her name, even though they hadn't confirmed the identity. I already knew. Karen Willis. The soprano who vanished one night after practice and was never seen again. Her voice used to linger in the rafters long after the choir had gone home. I remembered the last song she sang. It was the same song we had sung tonight. The same one the pipe bled through. I was detained for 32 hours. During that time, I wasn't allowed to call anyone except my brother. He didn't pick up. The church released a statement calling it a tragic discovery and vowed to cooperate. But they never said my name. They never said my innocence. When I was finally released, pending investigation, my apartment had been broken into. My music sheets were gone. My mother's last cassette tapes scattered and stepped on. I sat on the floor for hours, holding the crushed remains of her favorite Bach fugue, thinking about that sound, the one that didn't belong. I replayed it in my head, again and again. It wasn't just an accident. That organ wasn't haunted. It was hiding. Someone had used it as a tomb. Someone who knew how to access it. Someone who wanted to keep her silent. But the pipe betrayed them. Music is memory. It echoes what was lost. And something about tonight felt like an echo growing louder. demanding to be heard. I returned to the church at midnight. The police tape was still fresh across the entrance. But the back door, my musician's entrance, was left unlocked. Like always, I stepped in slowly. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my boots ringing like a warning. I approached the organ, stood in front of it, and placed my hand on the key that triggered the sound. I didn't play it. I just listened. Then I opened the bench where I kept my private collection of tapes backups. Sketches, and one tape my mother had made before she passed. It was old, warped. But when I played it into my portable recorder, her voice filled the air. Sweet, clear, and then suddenly interrupted. A woman screaming in the background. My mother gasping. Ah, doorslamming. I paused the tape. Rewound. Listened again. The scream. It wasn't just any scream. It was Karen's voice. I knew it the way you know a loved one's laugh in a crowd. I sat in the pew where she used to sit. I whispered to the stained glass saints that I didn't believe in. And I promised her I'd find the truth. Because someone had hidden her in the one place she loved most, and they thought I would be too scared. Toe broken. Too alone to fight back. They were wrong. I may just be the organist, but music is my weapon. And I was going to make sure the next sound that played from those pipes wasn't silence. It was justice. I am Elijah Carter, 28 years old, born and raised in West Philadelphia. My mother used to say I had music in my bones before I even spoke my first word. She was a choir, soprano in her youth, a nurse by day, and a dreamer by night. She taught me that music could heal what the world refused to touch. She died when I was 17. Lung cancer. Too late to save. Too poor to fight. But before she passed, she recorded her voice on old cassette tapes. Little messages wrapped in lullabies and prayers. They were all I had left of her. After she was gone, I stopped playing. I didn't touch a piano for years. Until one Sunday, out of sheer instinct, I walked into the Light of God church. I had passed it 1,000 times before. It was a grand old building. Red brick, with a rose window that caught the morning light like fire. The sign out front read, "All are welcome," though not everyone believed it. But that morning, something pulled me in. Reverend Simon was in the middle of his sermon. His voice carried like thunder, polished and rehearsed. The congregation leaned in, hungry for conviction. I didn't sit. I stood near the back, hand in pocket, eyes on the stained glass above the altar. Then the choir began to sing, and something inside me broke open. After the service, I approached the choir director, a tired but kind woman named Sister Evelyn. I told her I used to play organ. She blinked once, and then asked me to sit. That's all it took. One tryout, one hymn, and suddenly, I was their newest accompanist. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've played at every wedding, every funeral, every Sunday morning service. I didn't preach. I didn't lead. I just played. And for a while, that was enough. It gave me rhythm, purpose, routine, but routine, I've learned, is the enemy of truth. Because when something horrible becomes part of the background, you stop noticing the cracks. You stop asking questions, like why the central pipe had been sealed shut for years, or why Sister Karen Willis, the strongest soprano they had, vanished without even a farewell song. They said she left town, found a better choir, but nobody ever heard from her again. I believed what they told me, because believing meant I could keep playing. But now, I know better. After that night, the night of the bleeding pipes, I wasn't allowed back in the sanctuary. But I didn't stop searching. I spent days in the library, pulling blueprints of the original church organ, which was built in 1929 and renovated in 1987. I learned about the mechanics, the airflow chambers, the hidden access tunnels for maintenance. I learned that the main pipe, the one where they found Karen, was large enough to conceal a human body in the upper chamber, and that only 2 people had keys to the full inner cavity. One of them was Reverend Simon. The other was a man named Howard Lott, the church's old janitor who had died of a stroke 2 years ago. Or so they claimed. I started visiting the records office during lunch breaks, digging through donations, incident reports, maintenance logs. Most pages were clean. Too clean. No mention of Karen. No missing person report filed. It was like she'd never existed. Except, I remembered her voice. I remembered how she always stayed late to talk to my mother after rehearsal. I remembered the bracelet she wore with her daughter's name, Alina, engraved in small letters. And I remembered that just a week before she disappeared, she sang solo in a piece called Sanctuary. That was the last time I saw her. Hair pinned back, eyes closed, hitting a high note that made the rafters tremble. After that, she vanished. No funeral. No goodbye. Just an echo in a place that refused to mourn her. I started asking quiet questions. I approached Sister Evelyn, the same woman who welcomed me. I asked if she knew what happened to Karen. Her face changed. She looked over her shoulder before answering. "Don't dig into things that God has buried," she said. Then she walked away. But I wasn't asking God. I was asking people, and people lie. I found Alina online. It took days. She had changed her last name, moved to North Jersey, worked as a paralegal. I sent her a message. Simple. "I think I found something connected to your mother." She replied 4 hours later. "She's been gone 8 years. Don't do this unless it's real." I asked to meet. She agreed. We met at a diner halfway between our cities. She looked like her mother. Same deep brown eyes. Same slight dimples when she frowned. She didn't smile. She didn't touch her coffee. "What do you think you found?" she asked. I handed her the photo. A zoomed-in frame from the body discovery. "The bracelet?" Alina gasped. Her hand flew to her neck, where the matching pendant still hung. "That's hers," she whispered. "That's my mom's." I told her everything. About the sound. The bleeding pipe. The tape with the scream. She didn't cry. She just nodded. I always knew she didn't leave us. I asked her if her mother had any enemies. She said Karen had filed complaints once. About someone in the church. She said he was hurting people. That he had secrets. But the church closed ranks. Said she was hysterical. Threatened to revoke her membership. I asked who it was. Alina didn't hesitate. Reverend Simon. I walked back to my car that night feeling like the ground beneath me had changed shape. The man I had played for, smiled for, the man who baptized babies and buried the old, might have buried a woman alive in his own church. And for 8 years, no one said a word. They called her a runaway. They called me a suspect. But neither of us were guilty. We were just inconvenient. I got home and replayed the tape again. My mother's voice. Karen's scream. A door slamming. Then a faint whisper. I boosted the volume. Played it 10 times. It said one word. Organ. That's when I knew. The sound wasn't a mistake. It was a message. She wanted to be found. And now that she was, I wouldn't stop until they heard her song. Reverend Simon Brooks had a voice that could split silence like thunder over still water. He stood tall at 6'3", always in his sharply pressed clerical collar and black suit. His salt and pepper hair parted with precision. His gaze steady and cold as polished glass. To the congregation. He was the shepherd. The guardian of sacred truth. The man who built Philadelphia Light of God Church into the city's largest Protestant sanctuary east of Broad Street. To me, he had always been a storm behind stained glass. I remember the first time I shook his hand. It was the day I officially became the church organist. His grip was firm, but not warm. "Do not forget," he said, eyes fixed on mine. "You play to support the word, not to distract from it." That was his doctrine. Music was background. Emotion was regulated. Questions were unwelcome. Over the years, I watched him sculpt the church into a temple of silence, of tight control and obedience disguised as order. No sermon lasted longer than 30 minutes. No member stepped out of line. Those who did simply disappeared from choir lists, deacon meetings, or Sunday pews. Nobody asked where they went. We just lowered our voices and kept singing. There were whispers, of course, about how the financial ledgers never added up, about how some choir members felt uncomfortable alone in his office, but nothing ever stuck. Because Reverend Simon had connections. The mayor called him by first name. The police chief attended his annual gala. He was the man they photographed handing out turkeys every Thanksgiving. The man who laid the first brick of the community shelter. The man who never raised his voice in public because he never needed to. Power whispered for him. After Karen disappeared, he told the choir that she had left for a recording opportunity in Baltimore, that she had been unhappy and chose to move on. He spoke with such finality that no one dared question him. And those who did, like Sister June from the alto section, suddenly stopped attending rehearsal. When I asked Evelyn about her, she shrugged. Sometimes God calls people elsewhere. But it wasn't God that made people vanish. It was fear. It was Reverend Simon. And now, in the wake of the organ pipe discovery, he stood at the pulpit once more calm, composed. Unshaken. We mourn the tragedy uncovered in our house of worship. He said that Sunday, voice as smooth as silk. We await answers, but let us not be quick to accuse. The devil thrives in division. He looked right at me as he said it. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, just stared, like a man confident he would never fall. The congregation nodded, murmuring amens. Only a few eyes turned toward me uncertain, confused. I was still suspended from playing, sitting in the back row like a shadow of myself. And that's when I realized the truth. I wasn't just fighting a man. I was fighting a structure, a theology of silence, a hierarchy of fear. I had no title, no authority, no protection, just a cassette tape, a dead woman's bracelet, and a promise made to her daughter. But I also had memory, and in that memory was something Reverend Simon couldn't control. I remembered a night almost 2 years ago when I had stayed late after choir rehearsal to fix a sticky pedal on the organ. The sanctuary was dark, lit only by the red exit sign above the vestibule. I had heard voices from his office, raised, tense. I crept closer. Through the gap in the door, I saw Karen standing, hands shaking, holding what looked like a folder. "If you don't report this," she said. "I will." "You won't," Simon said quietly. "Because if you do, I'll make sure no one remembers you." The door shut. The lights went off. I dismissed it then, told myself I misunderstood. But now I knew better. Karen hadn't disappeared. She'd been silenced. By someone who had rewritten the rules. Simon hadn't just bent the church's power. He had remade it. Recast sin as rumor. Turned truth into betrayal. And in doing so, created a sanctuary, not of God, but of himself. The next day, I went to the choir room. It was empty. Cold. Like memory had drained out of the walls. But in one of the drawers where we kept old sheet music, I found a page, torn, folded, and tucked behind a hymnal. It was a letter, written in neat cursive, To whomever finds this, if anything happens to me, please look inside the organ. The large pipe, the one that never plays. I was told never to speak again. But I can't let what I know die with me. No name, no date, but I knew it was her. I brought the letter to the police. They took it, thanked me, and told me not to interfere further. I could tell they didn't believe me. Or worse, they didn't want to. After all, who would believe the organist over the reverend with citywide connections? Who would believe the broken cassette? The faded letter? Over a man with clean hands and Sunday applause. I stood outside the church that night, watching the lights go out one by one, and I knew the truth wouldn't come from inside. It had to come from us, the forgotten, the doubted, the silenced. Karen tried to speak. They stopped her, but her echo remained. In the pipes, in the tapes, in the silence after every sermon, and I promised myself again, I would not let that echo die. The following Monday morning, I woke up to the sound of fists pounding on my door. Not knocks pounds. I stumbled out of bed, heart thudding, still in the same hoodie I'd worn the night before, and opened the door to find 2 officers standing in the hallway. Their eyes were already judging me. One of them, Officer Maddox, stepped forward and handed me a sealed document. Search warrant, he said. For what? I asked. Voice cracking. For everything, he replied. They pushed past me without waiting for an answer. My apartment, already small, became claustrophobic with the weight of their presence. They opened every drawer, dumped out boxes of tapes, rifled through clothes, kicked aside my keyboard, knocked over the framed photo of my mother that sat beside the old stereo. I tried to speak, but every time I opened my mouth, they told me to sit and wait, as if I were already guilty, as if I was something to be handled. When they finally left, 3 hours later, they took with them 6 cassette tapes, my hard drive, and my journal. I didn't even know what they were looking for, but it didn't matter. In their eyes, I had gone from suspect to liability. I was the last one to touch the organ before the discovery. I had access to the bench, to the room, to the sound system. I was a convenient narrative. I called Alina later that afternoon. She had just gotten off work. Her voice tight. They came to me too. She said, asked if I thought you were obsessive. If you had ever talked about hurting anyone. What did you say? I asked. I said you were the only one who ever listened. Her voice broke. And I told them if anything happens to you, I'll burn that whole church to the ground. I smiled for the first time in days. That's when I knew I wasn't alone. But being right doesn't mean being safe. That night, I walked to the church, thinking maybe I could find more in the blueprints, in the architectural crawl spaces beneath the sanctuary. I still had the scanned copy on my phone from the city archives. The blueprint showed a narrow access path between the pipes and the back wall, only reachable from a small service panel behind the altar, a panel I had never seen open. I slipped in through the side door again. My hands were shaking as I passed the fellowship hall, the nursery, the corridor lined with faded photos of Sunday school graduations and baptism certificates. Everything looked so normal, so clean, but I knew better now. Evil doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it wears polished shoes and quotes scripture. I reached the sanctuary. The altar was draped in purple for Lent. The massive organ still towering like a silent beast above. I moved slowly behind the pulpit, feeling the wall with my fingers until I found it a metal latch, cold and rusted. I pressed. It clicked open. A narrow stairwell descended into pitch black. I hesitated. Then I stepped in. The air was thick, dry, smelling of dust and copper. I clicked on the flashlight from my phone. The space was barely wide enough for me to move. The walls were lined with old wires, decaying insulation, and cobwebs thick as rope. After 15 feet, I saw it a small metal box, attached to the rear of the central pipe. A sound amplifier. Unmarked. Custom-made. Someone had installed it to control resonance directly. It wasn't in the blueprints. It wasn't official. And only someone who knew the sound system intimately could have done it. My mind spun. What if the sound that night wasn't a glitch? What if it had been triggered? A warning. A call. A mistake by someone trying to keep the organ quiet. I reached for the box. As soon as I touched it, I heard footsteps above me. Heavy. Measured. Coming down the main aisle. I froze. Turned off my flashlight. Held my breath. The footsteps stopped near the altar. Then came a voice. Calm. Smooth. Dangerous. Elijah. Reverend Simon. If you wanted to confess, he said, you could have done it like a man, instead of sneaking around like a rat. I stayed silent. You're digging in places that were buried for good reason, he said. This church has survived wars, scandals, even bankruptcies, but we don't survive betrayal. I heard the click of a switch. The light in the sanctuary dimmed. Then, a low hum from the organ. It was on. Even with no one at the bench, the pipe began to vibrate. Not loud, but deep, like something groaning from under the floorboards. I panicked, crawled backward through the crawl space, bumping into wires and beams. I emerged through the panel, breathless, and found him standing just feet away. His face was unreadable. What did you do to her? I asked. He smiled faintly. What did she do to herself? I charged forward. But before I could reach him, a third person stepped between us. It was Officer Maddox. Enough, he said. He looked at me, then back at the Reverend. Mr. Carter, you're under investigation. I suggest you go home. Now. I wanted to scream, to tell him everything, but I knew how this worked. It wasn't about justice. It was about narrative. And mine was already being written for me. I left the church, the organ still humming behind me. When I got home, I found my front door ajar. My stomach dropped. I entered slowly. Every drawer had been opened again. Every photograph turned face down. But there was one thing they left behind. On my bed sat the cassette tape of my mother's voice. Broken in two. I stared at it for a long time. Then I picked up the pieces. Because sometimes, the only way to be heard is to become the sound no one can ignore. I spent the next day staring at the broken cassette tape like it was a relic from another life. My mother's voice, her songs, her comfort, shattered in half by hands that wanted to erase more than memory. I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by silence. But my mind was screaming. I knew then what I had to do. I couldn't just mourn anymore. I had to act. If they feared what was on the tape, then it meant it mattered. And if it mattered, there had to be a copy. I remembered something my mother once told me when I was a child. Sitting on her lap by the old turntable, always back up your voice, she said. The world likes to pretend we never existed. She used to make duplicates of her tapes just in case. I tore through the shoeboxes in my closet, the forgotten folders under the bed, the stack of old VHS and cassettes in the kitchen cabinet above the microwave, and then, in the back of a drawer I hadn't opened in years, I found it, a label in her neat handwriting. March 14, church practice. I popped the tape into the last surviving cassette player I owned, held my breath, and pressed play. Static first. Then the familiar click. Her voice. Testing. 1, 2. Okay. We're here at rehearsal. Elia. Don't touch that pedal yet. Karen. Could you? Her voice trailed off. Another voice came in. Karen's. I don't feel safe anymore. A pause. He followed me into the rehearsal room again. Said I was sowing dissent. My mother's voice. Calmer now. Did he touch you? No. Karen whispered. But he said if I talked, I'd regret it. That my daughter would pay. The tape went silent. Then footsteps. A door creaking open. Karen again. Panicked. We're not alone. Click. End. My hands trembled. It wasn't just an argument. It was a threat. A documented one. A moment that should have triggered an investigation 8 years ago. But no one listened. They muted her. Just like they tried to mute me. I took the tape and made 3 digital copies. One for me. One I uploaded to a secure drive. And one I burned onto a CD. Then I called Alina. She met me again. This time in a library parking lot, where the security cameras could see us. I handed her the CD. If I disappear, I said, you send this to every reporter in the city. She didn't speak. Just nodded and slipped it into her coat pocket like it was a weapon. Because it was. That night, I returned to the blueprints. There was something I had missed. Something that kept eating at me. If the amplifier behind the pipe wasn't original, then someone had added it during renovation, and someone had funded it. I went back into the church's archives, public financial documents buried under donor lists and tax statements. I cross-checked the date of the last renovation with contractor records. One name came up over and over again. Lott and Sons Acoustics. The same Lott whose father had been the church janitor, the same man who had supposedly died 2 years ago. I ran a search. No obituary. No death certificate. I called every Lott listed in the Philadelphia directory. On the 6th try, someone answered. This is Robert Lott, he said. I froze. I thought you were dead. I said. Silence. Then a sigh. Depends on who's asking. I explained who I was. Told him what I'd found. Told him about Karen. About the amplifier. About the sound. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, meet me. Tomorrow. Roosevelt Cemetery. Noon. He hung up. The next day. I arrived early. The wind was cold. The trees skeletal. Robert Lott looked nothing like I remembered. Older. Thinner. A limp in his left leg. But his eyes were sharp. Scanning me like a man who didn't trust shadows. You're the organist, he said. I was. Still are. That sound didn't come from nowhere. He lit a cigarette. Hands trembling. I installed the amplifier, he said. But I didn't know what he was going to use it for. Reverend Simon said it was for enhancing resonance. Said it would make the church sing. Paid cash. No records. I played him the recording. His cigarette fell from his hand. That poor woman, he whispered. She came to me once. Said she heard something strange in the pipes. Asked me to open them. I said no. I was afraid. Why? I asked. He looked away. Because the last person who asked too many questions was found in a river. He handed me a key. This opens the maintenance vault beneath the sanctuary. It's off the books. Only 2 were ever made. He kept mine. Thought I might need it. Why now? I asked. Because you already rattled the cage, he said. Might as well finish the fight. That night, I returned to the church again. For the last time. The storm clouds had gathered, and the street lamps flickered like omens. I unlocked the vault, descended the narrow stairs, and found a room beneath the sanctuary floor. Dusty, cold, filled with spare pipes. tuning tools, and files. Stacks of them. Personnel records. Complaint forms. Even a journal Karen's half filled with entries. I read them by flashlight. He calls me sister in public. In private, I'm a threat. He says the choir belongs to God but acts like he owns our voices. I tried to speak. Now I whisper, but I will not go quiet. Not ever. I gathered everything. Took photos. Made copies. The next morning, I emailed it all to the police. To the media. To 3 separate advocacy groups. I used an anonymous sender. I didn't need credit. I just needed it out. That Sunday, the organ did not play. The choir did not sing. And for the first time in 8 years, the sanctuary echoed not with music, but with silence. The kind that demands to be broken. They never said her name from the pulpit. Not once. Not during the Sunday statement from the board. Not in the local news interviews conducted right outside the church gates. Not even in the carefully crafted PR letter mailed to every household on the membership list. They called her the deceased. The individual found. The woman involved in the matter under investigation. But I knew her name. Karen Willis. She had sung soprano with the clarity of stained glass catching morning light. She had shown up early to rehearsals. Stayed late to clean. Brought cookies for the 10-year-old soloist who always cried before singing. She was a mother, a daughter, a voice that had dared to say no in a place where silence was currency. And now, years after they tried to erase her, they were still afraid to speak her name. But I would. I went to Alina and told her what I found. Her mother's journal. Her final thoughts written in uneven cursive on water-stained pages. I have copies of everything. I said, if you want to come forward, we'll do it together. But I won't share a word without your say. So, she looked at me with tired, wounded eyes that had seen too much for someone her age. You think they'll listen? Not all of them. I admit it. But enough. Enough to make them hear her. Even now. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I want to sing. I didn't understand. She repeated. I want to sing for her. One last time. So we did. That Saturday, we held a memorial. Not in a church. Not in a hall. In the old community garden on 49th Street, where Karen used to volunteer during summer break. We borrowed speakers, a microphone, set up folding chairs under the maple trees that were just beginning to bud. We didn't send invites. We just spread the word through whispers. Text chains. Truth-tellers brave enough to defy the silence. I opened with the truth. I didn't have a suit. I didn't speak like a preacher. I just told the story. What Karen endured. What she warned about. What she lost. And what she left behind. I ended by saying her name aloud. Once. Then again. Then a third time. Until the crowd joined me. Karen. 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 And then Alina stepped up. She wore a simple white dress and held a single lily in her hand. This was the last song my mother sang in church. She said. She never got to finish it. So I will. She began softly. The opening bars of Sanctuary, her voice was untrained, but full of something no lesson could ever teach grief. Defiance. Love. As she reached the final note, her voice broke, but the crowd picked it up, one by one, until the entire garden became a choir of resistance. A requiem for a woman they were never supposed to remember. Afterward, people came forward, quietly. They told us stories, of strange dismissals, of covered-up complaints, of Sundays that felt more like stage plays than worship. One woman, a Formation member, whispered. She warned me. I didn't listen. Another said, I thought I was the only one. The next morning, the Philadelphia Tribune ran the headline, "Whistleblower's Daughter Breaks Church Silence in Garden Requiem." The article named Karen, named Simon, quoted the Journal, quoted me. It went viral within hours. National outlets picked it up. Advocacy groups called for independent investigations. The district attorney's office launched a probe into church misconduct, citing new and credible evidence of obstruction, intimidation, and concealed abuse. And for the first time, Reverend Simon didn't show up on Sunday. He didn't appear in a black suit. He didn't stand behind the pulpit. He didn't lead a prayer. The board announced he was on sabbatical, but we knew better. That week, I walked into the sanctuary alone. I sat at the organ. Dust clung to the keys. The silence had a weight. I placed my fingers on the notes and played the melody Karen never got to finish. One verse. Just one. Then I stopped. Because some songs aren't meant to end. They're meant to be passed on. Voices layered through memory. Built on pain. Surviving in echoes. And as the final note lingered, I looked toward the central pipe, the one that bled truth, and whispered, "You were never nameless. You were never gone. They just wanted us to forget. But we didn't. We never will. It happened faster than I expected. Maybe it was the viral video from the garden service. The way Alina's voice cracked on that last high note, and every soul in the audience rose like an unspoken army. Maybe it was the copies of Karen's journal we'd submitted to the district attorney's office, each page heavy with accusation, confession, and fear. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the voices of ordinary people who had once sat quietly in the pews of Philadelphia Light of God Church and now stood up with their backs straight and names unhidden. Whatever it was. The tipping point came on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting on the edge of my mattress, staring at the half-tuned keyboard in the corner. When my phone buzzed, it was Alina. No words, just a link. I clicked. Local news, live stream. Cameras swarming the church steps, red and blue lights flashing. Officers filing inside. Their boots echoing through the old wooden floor. And then, there he was, Reverend Simon Brooks, being led out of the sanctuary he had ruled for over 2 decades. Hands cuffed in front of him. Collar still stiff and white. Expression unreadable. The news anchor's voice trembled as she read. The Reverend Simon Brooks has been taken into custody this morning, following new evidence tied to the long-cold case of Karen Willis. He is currently being investigated for obstruction of justice, abuse of authority, and involvement in the concealment of a human body on church property. I didn't cheer. I didn't move. I just exhaled, because I had seen too many lies buried under polite applause, too many victims labeled as disruptions, and now, finally, the disruption had become too loud to silence. That evening, I returned to the church not as a musician, not as a suspect, but as a witness. The doors were wide open. The sanctuary empty. Caution tape still lined the choir loft. But the organ loomed above, no longer a symbol of reverence. It was evidence. I walked up to the pulpit where Simon once stood, the place where he warned of devils in the world while hiding the ones he created. The chair he used to sit in, the one carved with gold leaf and high-backed like a throne, now sat toppled on its side. No one had bothered to lift it. I stood there for a while, alone in the fading light, until footsteps echoed behind me. Alina. She walked to the front pew, sat down, and looked up. They said his bail was denied. She murmured. He has to stay in custody during the trial. I nodded. He'll face what he made her face. Isolation. Silence. Except now the silence belongs to him. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small white envelope. They returned this from the evidence box. It was in my mother's locker all along. tucked behind the hymnal pages. I opened it gently. Inside was a photo Karen. Younger. Smiling with her arm around a toddler. Alina in front of the very organ where she would be found. On the back, she had written a single sentence. If anything happens, I know that I tried to protect what matters. I handed it back. Alina didn't cry. She didn't have to. Her strength wasn't in breaking. It was in standing. I returned home that night to find a letter slipped under my door. Handwritten. No. Return address. It read, "You made enemies, but you also made something stronger witnesses. Keep playing. Elia." Let the sound remind them. No name. No signature. But I recognized the handwriting. It belonged to Sister Evelyn, the tired old choir director who once told me not to ask questions. Maybe she had known all along. Or maybe, like so many, she was too afraid to speak until someone else lit the match. Either way, the silence was crumbling. The following Sunday, the sanctuary filled again, not with the usual pageantry. No callers, no processions, just people, plain clothes, folded programs, eyes wide open. I was asked by the interim board to play the organ for the service. At first, I said no, but then Alina placed her hand on mine and said, "This time, it's not for them, it's for her." So I did. I climbed the steps to the bench, adjusted the stool, and placed my fingers on the keys. The organ breathed again, but this time, it didn't groan, it didn't bleed. It sang, not for power, not for doctrine, but for memory, for resistance, for truth that refused to rot in brass. As the final chord rang out, I looked across the sanctuary. No one stood on a pedestal. No one hid behind robes. Just people holding hands, bowing heads, crying, healing. The chair once claimed by Simon remained empty. No one sat there. No one would again. Because that seat no longer belonged to authority. It belonged to accountability. And in that moment, I knew his fall wasn't just the end of a tyrant. It was the beginning of a new sound. A new sanctuary. A new choir of those who once whispered. Now, ready to sing. The pews smelled different that morning. Not of old varnish or incense, but of something fresher. Lemons and pine, and the faint trace of sunlit hope drifting through reopened stained glass windows. For the first time in over 2 months, the doors of the Philadelphia Light of God Church swung wide without shame, without secrecy, and without fear. Gone were the bulletins printed with Reverend Simon's face. Gone were the ominous reminders to remain united in silence. In their place stood paper programs with a single word in bold print across the top. Remembrance. Below it was a name, Karen Willis, printed in full, without apology, without euphemism. The woman they once ignored was now being honored in the sanctuary that tried to forget her. And the one they had tried to erase had become the reason people returned. I sat at the organ bench again, dressed in a simple navy suit, my fingers trembling over the keys, not with fear, but with reverence. I hadn't played in front of a full sanctuary since the day of the discovery, but today wasn't about me. It was about restoring something that had been broken. Not just the church, not just the name, but trust. Before I played, the new interim pastor, Reverend Linda McGrath, a soft-spoken woman with eyes that held both fire and sorrow, stepped forward. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to acknowledge every voice that was silenced, every truth that was buried, every question that was shamed. This sanctuary belongs to God, but it also belongs to the people, and today, we reclaim both." People clapped, gently at first, then louder, some even standing. I looked down at the keys. For the first time, they felt light beneath my hands. Not a burden. Not a battle. Just a beginning. The opening hymn was Blessed Assurance. Alina sang led. Her voice, raw but radiant, rose above the chords with something I couldn't describe, like grief repurposed into courage. The congregation followed, one verse at a time, until the walls echoed not with fear, but with affirmation. Afterward, I stepped down. I didn't expect anyone to speak to me, but they did. An older man with a cane gripped my shoulder and said, "I didn't know what happened back then. I should have asked." A woman who once sat behind Karen every Sunday wept openly as she handed me a lily and whispered, "Thank you for not letting her fade." Even Sister Evelyn approached, her eyes rimmed in red. A voice low, "I was a coward," she said, "but your music made me brave again." I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. Because sometimes, grace is quiet. Later that week, I received a call from the district attorney's office. Reverend Simon's indictment was official. Among the charges were obstruction of justice, intimidation of witnesses, and tampering with a crime scene. More testimonies had surfaced. More voix, once silenced, had begun to speak. A former choir boy who was too afraid to name the man behind the door now stood with his mother, telling the truth. A custodian who had cleaned bloodstains from the altar table was finally ready to testify. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about a culture of manipulation, of control, of fear, masked as faith. And it was crumbling, piece by piece, brick by brick. But something else was growing in its place. On Sunday evenings, we began hosting open rehearsals in the sanctuary, not just for trained singers, for anyone who needed to be heard, children, grandmothers, former members who had once fled in silence. The choir loft became a place of reclamation. People sang off-key, forgot lyrics, laughed when their voices cracked. And it was beautiful, because it was honest. One night, Alina brought her daughter, a tiny, bright-eyed girl named Grace, who had never heard her grandmother sing. We played a tape. Karen's voice, soft and trembling, filled the sanctuary. Little Grace looked up at the rafters, then whispered, "That sounds like light." I nodded, because it did. The church board, now entirely restructured, voted to rename the sanctuary. After a long, quiet deliberation, they chose the name Karen's Light Chapel. It was unveiled on the first Sunday of Advent. A new name carved in stone, beneath the same rose window that once shone over silence. This time, it shone over truth. At the dedication service, I played Amazing Grace on the restored organ. Every pipe had been cleaned, tuned, and blessed by the hands of volunteers, engineers, musicians, even children who wanted to be part of healing. The central pipe, the one that held her, was no longer hidden. It was engraved with a single plaque that read, "She was never forgotten." I saw strangers stop in front of it, hands trembling, eyes closed. Some prayed, some cried, some simply stood, bearing witness. And I realized something. Restoration isn't just about rebuilding what was lost. It's about rewriting what was erased. It's about honoring the voices that tried to warn us. About creating spaces where people are not just heard but believed. That night, I stayed in the sanctuary long after everyone left. I sat at the bench. The lights dimmed. The organ waiting. I played one final note. Just one. It hung in the air like a memory. And in that moment, I understood. We didn't just restore a church. We resurrected a voice, a name, a truth. And in doing so, we found our own. They asked me to write something for the reopening ceremony, a song, a speech, something to mark the turning of the page. I tried. I sat for hours at the old upright piano in my apartment. Fingers hoang or keys. Staring at blank sheets of staff paper. But nothing came. Every note felt too loud. Every lyric too clean. Too rehearsed. Because how do you put into music the sound of a life stolen? Then remembered, a name once buried now etched into stone. A daughter's grief turned into fire. A congregation's silence, broken by a choir of untrained but unwavering voices. You don't write that. You live it. And sometimes, you let it sing itself. So instead of composing, I brought back Karen's tape. The first one. The one where her voice cracked with hesitation and hope. The one where she dared to say, I don't feel safe anymore. We played it during the ceremony. Not to shock. Not to mourn. But to remember. When her voice echoed across the sanctuary, the room held its breath. No instruments. No applause. Just the truth. Raw and undeniable. For a full minute, no one moved. Then, one by one, they stood. The whole room, without being asked, without being led, they stood for her. For everyone who never got the chance to be heard. Alina walked to the front. Grace stood beside her, clutching her hand. And then Alina did something that tore the seams of every heart in that room. She lifted a piece of folded paper and began to sing. It wasn't perfect. Her voice wavered. She stumbled over a line. But it didn't matter. Because it was Karen's song. One she had written in the margins of her journal. A song she never got to finish. A lullaby for the silenced. A hymn for the brave. We called it The New Song. Afterward. Alina placed the lyrics on the altar beside a framed photo of her mother. In that photo, Karen is laughing. Not posing. Not preaching. Just laughing eyes squinting. Hell tilted back. Joy wrapped in sunlight. I thought about how many people had tried to erase her. How many closed doors. Rewritten files. Withheld words. And I thought about how none of it worked. Because here we were, singing her name into the rafters. Not out of guilt, but gratitude. The weeks that followed were full of change. Not perfect change. Not sudden transformation. But steady, intentional work. The church created a community panel made up of former victims, musicians, counselors, and youth leaders. They called it the Light Keepers. Their mission was simple: protect the vulnerable. Listen deeply. Speak boldly. I joined. So did Alina. So did Robert Lott, who came out of hiding and sat in the front row of our first meeting, with tears in his eyes. We hosted nights of open storytelling, testimonies from those once silenced, now loud with purpose. We lit candles for every voice once shamed. And we promised never again. One Sunday, I caught Sister Evelyn slipping a bouquet of lilies beneath the central pipe. She didn't say anything, just left them there. Her fingers brushing the plaque that read, "She was never forgotten." We locked eyes, and in hers, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Peace. On the last night of winter, I returned to the organ alone. I played the hymn we never used to play, the one Karen loved. The one the Reverend once banned for being too emotional. His eye is on the sparrow. I played it slow, reverent, the way my mother used to hum it while cleaning dishes. Halfway through, someone joined me. Then another. By the end, half a dozen people were in the sanctuary. Singing. No rehearsals. No microfones. Just voices. Rising. Healing. Becoming. I stepped away from the bench and let someone else play. Because the story wasn't mine anymore. It never was. It belonged to every voice they tried to silence, to every pew that sat empty while pain echoed beneath the floorboards, to every woman who was told she imagined it. To every man who carried shame he never earned. To every child who listened, learned, and chose differently. Outside, the sky turned gold. Inside, the sanctuary pulsed with warmth. I looked at the rose window above the altar. For years, it had cast its light over a house built on fear. But now, finally, it shone over something new. A place where voices rose not in whispers, but in song. A place where truth was louder than tradition. A place where names were remembered, where grief became music, and silence became light. The story of Philadelphia Light of God Church, body inside, organ pipes. Musician under investigation is not just a crime uncovered or a name restored. It is a reminder that truth does not decay with time. That voices, no matter how violently silenced, echo through generations when someone chooses to listen. Elijah Carter, a quiet organist who only wanted to play music, became the vessel for a truth buried in brass. Karen Willis, once labeled a problem, now stands as a symbol of bravery and sacrifice. And Alina, her daughter, turned grief into movement and silence into song. The lesson is clear. Power without accountability breeds silence, and silence kills. But one voice, no matter how uncertain, can light the way for others. We must protect that voice. Amplify it. Share it. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of someone who deserves to be heard, don't let it end here. Subscribe to stay connected with stories that matter. Leave a comment to share your thoughts. And share this story with someone who still believes in the power of truth, memory, and music. Because the most powerful sound in any sanctuary is the sound of someone finally being believed.